At long last, Swan is back. Welcome to the podcast, Swan. It's great to have you back on the show.
Oh, Pat, it's good to hear from you and see you again.
So this is sort of a self-indulgent episode. I just missed talking to you, Swan. So I figured I gotta get Swan back on because you were gone for a while, and you can catch us up on all that. But now you've returned. But since you've been gone, there's been a lot of exciting stuff happening around your work. So I want to briefly just mention some of that, which will set the stage for this conversation. You've obviously done a lot of work on the Papacy. You've been on my show before, especially my old show. So if people haven't seen all of our previous conversations, we did like a 3 to 4 hour conversation one time. I don't know, like a year or 2 years ago or something. It was brilliant on the Papacy. It was brilliant. So that's there. People can search for that, and I would recommend trying to track that down and find it. But relevant for today is, I think, is this. Fairly recently, a friend of ours, Cameron Bertuzzi, who's got a really good channel called Capturing Christianity. A little background of Cameron. For a while, he was sort of thinking very hard about Catholicism and discerning Catholicism, and he had lots of people on to make the case for and to make the case against. And Swan, you were one of those people. And then he had a lot of thinkers, Protestant thinkers, come on and make the case against. And nothing but kudos to Cameron. He really struck me as a guy who was really just trying to figure out, well, what's the truth of the matter here concerning Catholicism. Anyways, long story short, he recently announced that he is going to enter the Catholic Church. And one thing that he said in particular was that your argument, Swan, for the Papacy, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, was it was particularly influential in that. And I think because of that, it has brought a lot more attention to the work you've done, and a lot of conversation has gone on around this, especially like way more than I've been able to keep up with. I mean, this isn't my area of specialization anyways. I do like to try and just keep up in general, but it's totally beyond me now. Like, I don't know how many hours of back and forth there's been on this now. Way more than I've been able to keep up with, but it's a lot, and it's great because I think your work is brilliant and it deserves a lot of attention, and that attention is there now. So I just want to get your reaction to all of that. Did you think it would explode into the hot debate that it has become, and any comments you have about the role it played for Cameron or anything like that?
It's interesting because I had no expectations on where the argument would go, if it would be popular, if it would be recognized, if it would convert Cameron or not. Because from the very beginning, and I've said this before elsewhere, with Cameron's conversion, I think because in my own spiritual journey, when I was entering the church, the priest who I first consulted, Father Drew Hoffman, really great priest, we sat down in a coffee shop and he said, Swan, are you sure that you want to be Catholic? I mean, people are going to make fun of you. People are going to take you seriously. We're really hated. We're really misunderstood by the world, even by the Christian world. And it was interesting because this was the first time that when I sat down with a priest or a minister in general, they weren't trying to get me in, altar call, come on down now. It was, are you sure about this? You gotta, and I realized that, with this priest, he was respecting, the reality of the decision that I was making. And he also didn't want to coerce and push me into this. Right.
Yeah.
And so with Cameron, I had no expectations on, okay, he better convert, he better come in, or, oh, I'm putting all my hopes on this. I was just kind of like, okay, God, we'll see where this goes. People would ask me because they knew I was friends with him, hey, Swan, do you think Cameron's going to convert? And I'm like, I have no idea. And I don't particularly think about it because I don't want to put him in a situation or a situation for myself, right, where I'm like, oh, I really just wanted to convert, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, it's really his decision. So when I was gone for the 4 months with the Dominicans as a Dominican novice, there was one night where I think I was in my habit and I was on the computer, during our computer time looking at my emails. I think it was September 20th. I got this email from Cameron and the subject line on the email said Catholic. And I said, okay, that's a weird subject line. So I clicked on the email and Cameron told me that it was my argument that convinced him. And it made my little Dominican novice heart so happy. And I was telling everybody about it. And when we did evening prayer, during the time when we made our prayer petitions, I mentioned, Cameron's conversion and just joy over him.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, to me, it's funny because as you said, how it's overwhelming. I'm also kind of overwhelmed because I have people left and right who are inboxing me, asking me questions,
Of course.
video responses all over the place. And I even remember some of my friends who never were in this conversation before. They're kind of viewing this time as a way to make their platforms start to grow. So they start releasing response videos.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting to see like where the argument's going.
Yeah, so I want to say a couple things before we actually get into the argument. And guys, this will be basic. Like I said, Swan's got a ton of material on this. I just want to have Swan get the basic thrust out and respond to some of the more relevant criticisms, and then we'll point in different directions for those who want to go deeper. Your argument fascinates me, Swan, because I think if it's a good argument, I think it has a lot going for it. Then it is a very powerful consideration for Catholicism. But part of the reason I haven't kept up that much, Swan, is because like it wasn't the argument that convinced me. Why? Because it wasn't around when I converted. Right? So like I worry, like I would caution people about like putting all their eggs in this basket, if you know what I mean. Like clearly this argument wasn't needed for so many other people to see the truth of Catholicism or its inherent plausibility or even the papacy. So like while I think it's really fascinating and I try to generally keep up, it's not like for me like, oh, this argument better work or else right. Because I think Catholicism has an incredibly strong cumulative case from many other angles that confirm it. Yours would just be like I think another very substantial weight in the scale, but I don't think it's a necessary one. What are your thoughts on that and the kind of the general scene I'm laying out here? Do you agree?
Yeah, I wouldn't want anyone, right, to hinge a conversion to Catholicism or their Catholic faith on just this argument alone. I mean, as I said before, the argument is also in development in some areas, and I'm doing more research to further strengthen its premises, right?
Yeah.
And so, I would, just tell people to, enjoy what's going on, look at the research, look at it responsibly, right? I would tell them that. And then in terms of like your relationship with Christ and your relationship with the church, right? And well, with Christ through the church, you know, I think multiple people have said this, like, especially with Cameron, right? Like, you don't want to just have an intellectual conversion because when the trials come where you're being criticized for being Catholic, where your, followers are leaving you, where friends are betraying you, you need more than just an intellectual conversion to sustain you. And I think Cameron, from what I've seen, I mean, he's been he's been a big brother to me already, And so I really do believe that it's not just an intellectual conversion for him. And I don't mean that like in a pejorative way, like, oh, it was an intellectual conversion. He wasn't thinking. No, Christ fully has captured his heart and his mind.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, even for me, I think my intellect was with the Catholic Church before I really had my full conversion, if that makes sense. And of course, that was important for me for my way coming in. But what you say is, of course, deeply correct and extremely important. And God bless Cameron. I'm hoping to have him on in January. We've been discussing a little bit. So hopefully Pat, I'll be able to talk with him directly next month. Yeah,
I will add, though, that I think that before this argument was around, I mean, it's been around for, as Daniel Vecchio has discussed on my channel, it's been around for quite a while. At least the textual illusion in the first millennium, and then eventually it's built up into an argument for the papacy post-schism, right? And then especially during the Reformation. But I mean, the argument's been around for a while. I know, like, people like Scott Hahn and Jimmy Akin have been popularizing it before I was on the scene, right? So I think for a lot of people, though, like what they find really convincing about the papacy, this is just a guess. Think about like Joshua Sijuati's a priori argument for the papacy,
right?
You know, the need for order and eventually for the buck of authority to stop. I think
that was the strongest consideration for me. That's why I was so excited when Josh published that paper, because he essentially formalized what was really the biggest consideration for me, which was, it's not just, pure armchair speculation, but it is these certain considerations based on human anthropology and deep metaphysics. It would lead you to expect something like the papacy, which alleviates, I think, a significant burden that you have to carry historically, if that makes sense. And when Josh put that paper out, I'm like, this to me is where the real money is. And I'd like to draw more attention to that as well. Sorry to interject. I just wanted to say that for me, that was one of the biggest considerations.
I'm hoping to collaborate with Joshua in the future. So, trying to maybe do something with our arguments together, or, something like that.
That'd
So,
be great. Yeah.
that's going to be in store for the future, hopefully.
Yeah, and he's a convert too, and
Mhm.
he's taken sort of Swinburne's model, right? He's a big Swinburne fan, and he
Yeah.
just kind of kept being consistent with it, with the question of not just Christianity but the church, which I absolutely love, right? Okay, so Suan, we are in a little bit of a time crunch today because I'm doing a double header of podcast. So why don't we get right to it then? Give us the basic thrust for people who are unfamiliar of your new Eliakim argument. How do you like to present it these days? And then we'll just kind of explore around from there, if that's cool with you.
Yeah. So the argument goes in three phases. The first phase is to establish a textual allusion between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19.
Yep.
So if you recall, in Peter's great confession of Jesus' messiahship, Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you," this is verse 18, "and I tell you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it." And then in verse 19, and this is where we're really focusing, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." The first phase of the argument is trying to say that in verse 19, when Jesus mentions the keys in binding and loosing, he's alluding back to Isaiah 22:22, when in ancient Israel under King Hezekiah, there was a corrupt prime minister or chief steward named Shebna. And through the prophet Isaiah, God reveals that he's going to replace Shebna and put Eliakim in charge. In Isaiah 22:22, it says, "I will give you the key of the house of David. Whatever you open, none shall shut. Whatever you shut, none shall open." Right? So textual allusion, just to show you that whatever interpretation we're going to make from here, it has a textual basis. Phase two then argues that the relationship between Peter and Eliakim that is made in the textual allusion is a typological one. So very quickly, typology is this idea that in God's kind of predestination or providence or arrangement of salvation history, he has arranged figures or events or persons or actions to be read together as aligning and corresponding to each other, right? So, with the case of Eliakim and Isaiah 22 and Peter, Matthew 16:19, my argument is that we have a correspondence between historical persons, Eliakim, Peter, and we have a correspondence between events. Both of them are being elevated by God into positions of authority. They're both being given an office.
Right.
And so the last part of the argument is just to show how do you get from this Peter Eliakim typology into the papacy itself. Now, I'll mention, Pat, first time, you're getting the fresh scoop, a revision that we've made to the argument, right? Because we noticed that when we were debating our Protestant interlocutors, some of them were saying, "Oh, we'll grant the Peter Eliakim typology, but argue that it's not prime ministerial. It's something else," right? And so now we've revised the argument so that basically it goes like this, right? So, it's really nice and clean now than before. So I'm going to just read it out if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course. Please.
Okay, so phase one, textual allusion. Premise one, there is a textual allusion between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19. Okay, just state it nice and clean. Phase two, typology. If there is a textual allusion between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19, then there is a Peter Eliakim typology. Premise three, so there is a Peter Eliakim typology. Premise four, if there is a Peter Eliakim typology, then it is prime ministerial. So PET is prime ministerial. Oh, PET means Peter Eliakim typology.
Yep.
And then when we go down to like 6, 7, and 8, premises 6, 7, and 8, we're basically saying like, okay, a prime ministerial Peter Eliakim typology is much more expected on the papacy hypothesis, right? And then just showing that this is really strong evidence for the papacy hypothesis in scripture.
Yeah, which is, that's very Swinburnian there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So great. Okay, cool. I love it. So Suan, I'm going to let you be a little bit selective here because, like I said, there's two things I want to accomplish with our conversation today. One is to get a more condensed presentation of your argument, because out there's many 4-hour presentations. So I think it'll be nice if there's like a nice hour or less. Here's Suan's argument, at least in its general thrust. And then you picking which parts you want to kind of beef up and substantiate right now, and then also be a little selective in what you think the most relevant or interesting criticisms are that you'd like to address today? Again, understanding that there's a much larger debate going on.
Mm-hmm. What I'll do is I'll go through each phase of the argument, and from there, like I'll kind of show basically what's the defense of this part, right? And then from there, we might go. I think I'll probably go into some objections.
Beautiful.
In particular. So when we get to phase one, the textual illusion, what's fascinating about this part of the argument is that it has widespread scholarly support in terms of a textual illusion existing between Isaiah and Matthew.
Yeah.
So that might surprise a lot of people. But if you look at, for example, Craig L. Blomberg's commentary on the New Testament use of the Old, he basically says it's almost certain. Donald Guthrie in the New Bible Commentary says it's almost certain that Isaiah 22 is being invoked in Matthew 16:19. You have people like Timothy Rucker, who published his dissertation, or at least it's his major work in Morris Seebeck on, the keys, the temple keys of Isaiah, know. So, I mean, left and right, even in the most recent commentary that I looked at, which was published, this year by Walter Wilson, it was published by Erdman's. His commentary on Matthew, he mentions the textual illusion, right? So basically what I'm saying is that this is a widely recognized textual illusion among scholars now, right? Yeah. I mean, Patrick Gray, 2017, even said this is generally recognized, right, as being here. Now, there are some dissenters and there are some questions, right, on this part of the argument. So basically, let me go through what I did to defend this premise. So in the original video, I presented Richard Hayes's criteria for establishing a textual illusion, right? And I went through things like thematic coherence, so do both passages have similar themes? Did Matthew have access to the text of Isaiah such that he could make a textual illusion, or rather Jesus, because it's Jesus speaking in this context?
Right.
And, I went through and I basically said, I think we have strong reasons here, right, to believe that there is a textual illusion. It seems as if it meets all of the criteria or the criterion. So, the three, I think, strongest points in favor of a textual illusion are this. You have a syntactical correspondence. You have significant syntactical correspondences. That is to say that you see within the same passage itself, like you see the words appear in similar places where they'd be expected. So, for example, like you have, I will give, Old Testament, Jesus says, I will give, New Testament. Then they both give keys or a key of some kingdom, right? And then when you look in the Old Testament, the different versions of Nathan's prophecy that David's kingdom would last forever, God both says it's David's kingdom and his kingdom, right? So there was the kingdom of David and the kingdom of heaven were viewed synonymously in a way. Right. And so with that, then, okay, you see kingdom of heaven, New Testament, kingdom, house of David, Old Testament, right? And then you see then in the following parts with binding, loosing, open and shutting, right, that Peter and Eliakim are given definitive authority, right? Whatever you open, none shall shut. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And Jesus and God in the Old Testament use contrastive metaphors or images, right? Bind, loose, open, shut. So when you look at that all together, I think that presents a significant case that you have syntactical correspondences, right? When you look at the structures of the passage, right, it's I will give key, okay, of a kingdom, okay, and then afterwards it mentions what the person's going to do with that power and confirmation of that power. So look at that, that similar structure. I will give a key of a kingdom, and then what you do with it, it'll be affirmed or confirmed somehow. Yes. So with Eliakim, whatever you open, none shall shut. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, right? So similar structure. The third point that I would make is also just thematic coherence, right? So when you look at the rest of the passage too, you see a lot of things coming together in terms of similarities between, the Old Testament passage and the New Testament passage. So for example, you see that this is in the context of Peter replacing the Sadducees and the Pharisees. You see that this is in the context of, for example, the Messiahship of Christ being revealed. And you even see that Peter doesn't fully understand what he's saying, right? Because he thinks that when he just confessed that Jesus is going to be the Messiah, that doesn't involve the cross. Yeah. Right. And so he was expecting this triumphant Davidic Messiah. Right. And Jesus saying like, yeah, that's part of who I am, but also part of being the king is the cross and the resurrection. So, I just think when you look at these three things all together, I think you have a really strong case for a textual illusion. so the interesting, and then even I would add in too, like Peter is compared to a rock, Eliakim is compared to a peg. They're both compared to objects, right? I mean, so it gets really kind of uncanny once you start looking closely. So one of the objections that I've heard, and I only get into one,
Sure.
was basically like, well, if this is a textual illusion, then we would expect bind to correspond to shut and loose to correspond to open. So for example, instead of, we're having bind and bind in the New Testament, right? Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. But in the Old Testament, it's whatever you open, none shall shut. So you see, like, it doesn't use open twice in the Old Testament. It has shut the second time. And so, particularly John Noland in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, he's argued that this is why, we can't sustain a textual illusion. At least in my brief scoping of the literature, a lot of people have been saying like they can see like, okay, maybe this is a kind of difference, right? But they don't see it being significant at all. They see it as kind of a trivial difference.
Yeah.
Right. So for example, like even G.K. Beale, when he's discussing the book of Revelation, he talks about how, in one place, John in the book of Revelation uses keys, and then elsewhere he uses key, right? And he just says, the switch from keys to key is not significant. So, I don't think we need a further explanation, right? In the case of the difference between, let's say, Isaiah and Matthew here, a lot of people have said, especially I think Rucker too, only in his book kind of only alludes to like, okay, some people think that this breaks the textual illusion, right? But in light of all the other evidence, we have such strong reasons to believe that there is a textual illusion, right?
Yeah.
So, what I've been doing in my own research on this point is just to see, okay, why would Matthew not exactly correspond, right, to the Old Testament here, at least when Jesus is speaking? So to kind of, and this response is also still in development too. So I'll give you what I have so far, right? So I think the first thing is just when you look at the Old Testament, okay, and you have open, shut, and then shut, open. I mean, think about like, why do we, for example, when we say like it's an open and shut case, why don't we say it's a shut and open case, right? Like why? And it's just simply because that's the convention on how the words are used, right? Now go to the New Testament era with you have bind and loose. Why does bind come first? Why not loose? Well, that's just simply the convention, right? And so I see one reason why, Jesus would have maybe just used bind first, right, is simply because he wants to get across, he's using conventional Jewish language and he's communicating to a Jewish audience. The other possibility too is that, rather than confusing the metaphor, like if I say it's a shut and open case rather than an open shut case, right, you might be like, that's weird that he reversed it. Okay. But in the case of Jesus, if you say the exact power that the Pharisees and the Sadducees have, it would also make the allusion to the fact that you are replacing them even stronger, in my opinion, right? There are other things to keep in mind too. So I was looking at, for example, various features in Matthew's gospel, like wanting to include theology on heaven and earth, right? So what I've been doing is I've developed a chart, and I can probably pull it up if I can get it, where I just basically go through the alternate options and I show like where all of them might have strengths and where all of them might have weaknesses. So maybe I could share my screen with you, Pat.
Yeah, for sure.
And I can show the audience this. And also, if there are any typos, I do apologize.
That's all right. Rough drafts are acceptable here on the Pat Flynn Show.
So if you look at this chart, I don't know how clear it is, right?
Pulling it up here. So just by the way, because this will be on iTunes as well.
I see. Okay.
So if you're just listening, Swan, if you're okay with that, I'll try and post this chart on the show notes. Otherwise, just head to YouTube at this point, guys, and you can take a look at what's on the screen.
Yeah. So, so in this chart, I go through like the various options that you could have for, to make the textual illusion more obvious. And I look at like modification 1. So for example, let's say that Jesus said, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Right. So in the Old Testament, remember, open comes first and then shut comes second. Well, if loose corresponds more neatly to open and bind corresponds more neatly to shut, then maybe you could have it be like this, right? The other thing you could do is whatever you loose on earth shall not be bound in heaven. Whatever you bound on earth shall not have been loosed in heaven, or something like that.
Right.
The third modification is whatever you loose, none shall bound. Whatever you bound, none shall loose, right? So that's the closest correspondence. And I think the issue is that, okay, when you go to like option 3, the issue there is whenever you say like, whatever you loose, none shall bound, wherever you bound, none shall loose. It does have a really tight correspondence to Isaiah 22:22. Basically speaking, the only substitution is with the terms, like,
Right.
but that's it. But then you lose Matthew's and really Jesus's theology of heaven and earth, right? So Jonathan Pennington has done a great work showing like why this mention of heaven and earth is really significant in Matthew's gospel, because he's saying that in Christ, through the ministry of Christ, heaven and earth are being brought together. There's a oneness between all of creation through Christ. So, okay, there's something missing here, right? And then also when you look at the original construction of the passage, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Jesus is emphasizing that the decisions that are made on earth reflect the decisions that have already been made in heaven.
That's
and then
correct,
even
yeah.
with, and I call this the divine causality interpretation, where when Peter, for example, gives the confession, Jesus says, this wasn't by the power of flesh and blood. It wasn't by human power. It was through my Father.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense in 16:19 that Jesus would use this particular grammar to show, look, heaven is causing the initiative and then earth reflects the decisions of heaven.
That's right.
So, okay, I think there are good reasons to reject modification 3, whatever you loose, none shall bound. When it comes to modification 2, right? I mean, so whatever you loose on earth shall not be bound in heaven, right? So this interpretation, you get like, well, one of the issues is that you don't get really a divine causality interpretation anymore, right? So it's just like, okay, whatever you loose on earth, it shall not have been bound in heaven. So it's just saying your decisions on earth won't contradict the decisions in heaven, right? So that doesn't sound, for example, like an affirmation by affirmation. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven.
Right.
It's just, okay, your decisions won't contradict heaven's decisions. Maybe that would be important, but it misses out the divine causality aspect that is there in the passage. And so I think, okay, there's a reason why Jesus wouldn't choose this modification, right? Now, the modification 1 to me is the most plausible option in terms of like a counter to what's going on in the textual allusion. So if Jesus said, whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, right? I mean, so loose comes first as open in Isaiah 22:22, and bind comes second as shut in Isaiah 22:22.
Yes.
So this might be a plausible way to reconstruct the passage, right? But I think one of the reasons why, one of the problems with this particular argument is that I could still see someone complaining, well, but look, the structure, of open, shut, shut, open isn't exactly the same here, right? So someone could still complain that the illusion, isn't strong enough, and you could make the illusion stronger, which is one of the objections that someone has raised. And I'm kind of giving the shorthand version, and the person I talked to gives a much more sophisticated version, right? So we're kind of stuck between then these two passages or these two possibilities. So how do we adjudicate between them? So I think at this point, what I'm going to say is that I just don't think that, the differences are relevant enough to constitute switching one over the other.
Yes.
Right. They're both basically doing the same thing. Now, let me give you an example of kind of what I'm saying. So, for example, I think, so a reasonable explanation is that Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience. He's using a conventional idiom. One could be accused of overanalyzing the idiom at this point. It's like, okay, I think it did the job enough, right?
Yeah.
So to give an example, suppose that you go into a museum, right? And obviously, everybody knows the Mona Lisa, right? So suppose you go into a museum and you see an artist who's adapting the Mona Lisa into like a Van Gogh style, right? Now you could go up to this painting and say, well, I mean, he could have made it more obvious that it's the Mona Lisa, right? He could have maybe, kind of dimmed down some of the Van Goghing aspects. And it's like, well, no, you're missing the point.
Yeah, but in a sense, it's already obvious, right?
Right. It's like what makes an illusion successful is not that it's a quote, it's that it alludes.
Yes.
Right. Is that it's pointing to something. Right. So, for example, I could already be, let's say, extremely confident, even maybe 100%, if we're being kind of, a little bit, kind of loose with the term 100%. I could be 100% certain that something is alluding to another thing, even if it could be made more obvious. But at that point, then it would just be wasted effort to make it more obvious. It's like it's there.
Right.
So I think that's what's going on here. And I think that Jesus didn't feel the need to make it more obvious, if you will, by even switching the illusion and the convention around. Yeah. So
I
think
agree. I completely agree with your point there, Swan. One thing I appreciate about your work that I know many other people do as well is that you're very thorough. So we appreciate you, digging into this point that I think isn't that strong of an objection, but it just goes to show that Swan is dedicated to his project, which we all appreciate. So yeah, good. I'm satisfied with that response. So let's. I would just want to make sure we get as much in as possible before we have to close out here at 10:30. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when it comes to the second part of the argument, which is typological, right? We're particularly trying to establish that Peter is a prime ministerial kind of figure. Okay. So first, there's some people who reject that there's a typology going on in the first place. And this is where we've had some recent, interesting conversations, right? So some people say, well, Swan, you shouldn't call it a typological argument. The reason why I call it a typological argument is because I just simply think it's the correct categorization of what's going on here. Yeah. So if you look at the literature and contemporary scholarship on the nature of typology, they're going to talk about how it's a correspondence in salvation history, as indicated through a text, right? So it's not just something that you think in the mind or you kind of notice, oh, I see this and I see that. Oh, that's a parallel, right? It's more than that. It's saying that there's something in the text that warrants you to see two figures, two events connected to each other, okay? And it is a form of literal interpretation insofar as it's not just conveying, symbols and, that sort of thing. It's actually conveying something in God's salvation history, his divine arrangement of the plan of salvation, right? So that's why I'm comfortable with saying that this is a typology. There are people like Benedict Green and Benedict Viviano, both two Catholic scholars, who argue Peter is Eliakim is the Old Testament type of Peter. They have no problem saying that. So this isn't just me saying it. So in terms of establishing that the type is prime ministerial, or that the typology is prime ministerial, that is to say that it is, at least this is the minimum definition, that we have supremacy and succession. I mean, those are the two things that people really care about.
For the papacy, right? Yeah.
Right, for proving the papacy. And especially because I think you can get infallibility from supremacy if someone can make definitive binding decisions, right?
Right.
So to defend that Peter is a prime ministerial figure, what we do, at least what my team and I have been doing, is we've been developing now hermeneutics for interpreting typology, right? So if you do have a typological connection, what are some principles that you're going to need in order to properly interpret what's going on? And I think I'll mention only one thing, right? Because I mean, some of these are under development and I don't want to present all of the things, right? And then not have enough time to explain or defend them. But the big thing that you have to remember is that typology is a hermeneutic of continuity. And I know that term or phrase usually appears in Vatican II debates, right? But I think it's applicable here because what's going on in the New Testament is that they're using typology. In fact, I think it was Leonard Goppold who said that typology is the way in which the New Testament authors connected the Old Testament to the New Testament events. It was a very apostolic hermeneutic to do this kind of to use this kind of method. It's a hermeneutic of continuity, so it's trying to show that something in the old is carrying over into the new.
Yeah.
So if you will, the default is in favor of transfer of properties, right? But then what we look at in particular then are what kinds of properties transfer over. Okay. So what we do then is that we look into the Old Testament and we look at what are called theologically defining properties, right? That is to say that we look at properties that, broadly speaking, right, God, for example, why did God choose this person? What distinguishes them from the rest of the Old Testament figures? What makes them unique in God's eyes? And then we see, okay, these broad features, do they, we can then say that these features transfer over into the new, right? If once again, typology is creating a correspondence between figures and persons, right? I think the typology between Peter and Eliakim rises to one where we can call Peter the new Eliakim, given just how significant the textual allusion is and the substitution that's going on there.
Even if they didn't have the same hair color, for example.
Right. So, and obviously, like typology is not concerned with the most minimal, trivial properties, right?
Right, yeah.
We're looking at in God's salvation history, in the plan that's going on, what really made, for example, Moses stand out. Okay, well, Moses was a miracle working prophet who led Israel to redemption, right? And, there are other things that fall under that, like he gave the law, he built a judicial system, right? And other things like that. And my point here is, okay, we can, like, people aren't ordinarily skeptics of this kind of exegesis or this kind of work, so people aren't usually like, oh, well, I don't know what the theologically defining properties of Moses are. Oh, but with Peter and Eliakim, we don't know. It's speculation.
Let me take my skeptical dial and just artificially crank it as high it can go right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's have skepticism run amok, as I said.
Right. Yeah. And that's just a point about consistency, right? Which
Right.
is, look, we should try to be as consistent. Like if we would object to artificially dialing up the skeptical dial, say in conversations with atheists, right, in relation to Christianity, right? If you're a Protestant, then you want to be careful that you're not kind of pulling that same move when it comes to conversations with Catholics.
Exactly.
And of course, to be fair, the other way around in all situations and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, so because typology is a hermeneutic of continuity, and I think you have a significant correspondence between the persons of Eliakim and Peter, I think we're warranted, right, in just looking at what are the theological properties of Eliakim, and then seeing, do they transfer over unless there are defeaters, right?
Yeah.
So actually, this is the second principle. So I kind of accidentally, and they're all connected, so they boil into each other. So I need to be careful to stop myself here.
No, that's okay. This is great.
Yeah, or else I'm going to reveal all the eggs in the basket. So what's going on?
But the point is, you really do have principles working here, right?
Yeah, we do have working principles, and our goal is to try to show that each of these principles are intrinsically plausible, right? So some people are going to say, and I can already hear them, right? They're going to say like, oh, Swan, you just conveniently created these principles that would validate your typology. And it's like, no, I think these are actually in themselves plausible principles. Like all of us, for example, are doing, whether or not we realize it or have or put the effort into it, we're concerned with the theology of continuity and discontinuity. Yeah. We're concerned with how the Old Testament connects to the New Testament, right? And, our Jewish brothers and sisters might accuse us of being arbitrary. Like, oh, you're deciding this transfers over, but not that. And what we're trying to show is, no, there are principled reasons why one thing transfers over rather than the other. I mean, even Paul does this, right? When he talks about the righteousness of the patriarchs and how they were justified before the law of Moses. So it's trying to show continuity and not rupture. And so I'm trying to do that with our same kind of approach to things.
Yeah, very good. Okay, awesome. Yeah. Where to next?
Yeah, so after kind of talking about how typology is a hermeneutic of continuity, what we do look at then is just, okay, it seems like what we seem to have so far favors Peter being a kind of prime ministerial figure, especially like given the context of Jesus being the Davidic king in the New Testament. And Matthew's gospel in particular. And then even I think Walter Wilson in his commentary mentions that the background of even Matthew 16 is the Davidic covenant. So I'm like, okay, we have so much going here, right? For a continuity being favored rather than a discontinuity. And so one thing that I emphasize is like, if you think about like when Paul talks about in, I think it's 1 Corinthians, about the headship of men in marriage and the family, right? Somebody might say, oh, well, Pat, when you look at the New Testament, it's the women who are the first to arrive at the empty tomb, and they're the first evangelists, really, and the men chicken out, right? So how can God say that there's a headship of men when obviously, like the evidence shows that women exercise headship too, or women do significant things? Like think about Deborah in the Old Testament; she was literally a leader and a prophet, right? And the thing is, what one could say is, okay, sure, like you have these instances where women do exercise headship, right, and they do leadership roles and all that, and that's great. Phoebe being the deaconess of the church in Rome, okay, these examples. But the point is that God is saying, but the normative way in which he set up creation, right, is that men would have headship, okay? And if I get canceled for that, oh well, go talk.
It's my channel that goes down now, Swan.
Yeah. Go talk to St. Paul too, So there's that. And so you would recognize that, okay, these other kind of discrepancies, if you will, with the primacy of men hypothesis, it has to be accommodated because you have a divine normative command on the order of things, right? And so what I'm saying here is that when we look at the typology here, we shouldn't dismiss it or even downplay it, because what if the same situation is going on here with Peter and Eliakim, where God is establishing the divine normative order of his church, and these other places where you might see Peter being weaker, or you might see Paul kind of looking like he's the head guy, or James looking like he's the head guy. What if it's possible that these are compatible, right, with still in the divine normative order of the church, Peter having the primacy of headship, right? And so what I want to do is I want to make sure, okay, we're not underselling the typology. And so this is why I think the debate right now is really hinging on who has the best hermeneutical principles for interpreting the typological relationship that's going on.
Yes.
Because when we can do that, then we can start talking about, oh, how should we use other New Testament passages to assess the typology? So, for example, some Protestants that we've engaged with, my team and I, what some of the Protestants are assuming is, oh, no, 18:18 limits Peter. And Acts 15, where James makes the final ruling, that limits Peter. So you notice that there's a kind of assumption that the rest of the New Testament is limiting Peter, right? Or it's like, oh yeah, like the vestiture of authority that he received in 1619 is so great, but everything else nuances that, right? But I mean, think about, for example, like Pat in your marriage, right? You're the head of the family, but you might make decisions with your wife where she has equal authority, or maybe you might even give a lot of your authority over a matter to your wife to let her take care of it.
She gets to pick our afternoon plans today. That's already been decided.
Right. And someone might say, well, Pat, you're not exercising your headship as a man, right? And it's like, no, like out of love, out of, let's say, the familial collegial aspect that's there in the family, you allow your wife to share in your authority. You participate, she participates in it, right? And so in the same way with these other instances where I think people try to establish defeaters or limitations on Peter's authority, what if it's simply the case that out of the brotherhood of the apostles, the collegial aspect of the apostolic college, that others can participate and share in some way, even in Peter's authority, which is ultimately sharing in Christ's authority.
Right.
So basically, I think we need to be careful here, not to just assume that Peter's being limited by everything else in the New Testament.
Yeah, first off, that fits beautifully with the general participation metaphysics, and that
I knew you'd like that.
So attractive and true anyways, right? And that's one of the things that really drew me to not just classical theism, but Catholicism as well. And then, of course, I just want to note, like, look, there's no short responses from Catholics of how to make sense of these passages in light of papal authority and all those things. Those are already out there, right? And those were things I did consider in my conversion, right?
Yeah.
And I always did find those responses ultimately satisfactory. And I think you could just transfer those in relation to what you're saying as well. So we don't have to go into those now. I'm sure people are generally familiar with them. If not, then they can get familiar somewhere, right?
Yeah.
They're everywhere, right? Cool.
Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I'll focus on then is probably like the most popular objection that I've heard to the argument. I don't know if I can give it a full response at this time to it, but like, here's basically what it is, right? And I can flesh out like how I'm going to go about responding to it. So the main argument is that there's a Jesus Eliakim typology in the New Testament, not a Peter Eliakim typology, right? Or if there is a Jesus Eliakim typology and a Peter Eliakim typology, then the Jesus Eliakim relationship somehow limits, right, the Peter Eliakim relationship. So the reason why people think there's a Jesus Eliakim typology is because Revelation 3:7, where Jesus is speaking to John, and he mentions that he has the key of David, and whatever he opens, none shall shut. Whatever he shuts, none shall open. Right. So I mean, in Revelation 3:7, you have a pretty nice textual allusion, if not basically a quotation of the Isaiah 22 passage, although there is a variation. Right. So Jesus says, I have the key of David, whereas the Old Testament passage says that Eliakim has the key of the house of David. Yeah. So it's interesting that Jesus just has the key of David, right? Like he just has it, maybe the house is boiled into that. Who knows? But anyway, so I think here what Jesus is doing fits within a typological mode. So I actually agree that there is a Jesus Eliakim typology because he's substituting what was Eliakim's position or a place in the text with his position. So think about like in John's gospel, when Jesus says, just as the serpent was lifted in the desert, so the Son of Man shall be lifted for the sins of the world. Right. I mean, you can see there's a typology going on there because Jesus is substituting himself with an Old Testament figure, in this case being the serpent that Moses lifted to save the people from their snake bites in the desert, right? So, okay, let's say we have a Jesus Eliakim typology. What exactly does that tell us then about the Peter Eliakim typology, right? So what I've been doing in my own response is I've been saying, okay, maybe let's run with this idea for a little bit, that somehow Jesus being Eliakim limits Peter being Eliakim. How? And how much, right? Like, you can't just say like, oh, there's a Jesus Eliakim typology. It limits how much Peter can be Eliakim, and then you just run off, right? Because some people, they do this kind of hit and run argument. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, that's just an assertion, I don't know. And then especially like if they don't offer a methodology for adjudicating. So for example, like, I mean, let me propose to you a model right now on how Jesus can be Eliakim and Peter can be Eliakim, right? So in the case of Revelation, I think what it's saying there is that Jesus is something like the chief steward of God the Father, the chief servant of God the Father, right? In terms of mediating salvation between God and man. So in that way, I could see Jesus being the steward of the Father, right? But in Matthew's gospel, especially with the emphasis on the Davidic kingdom and the incarnate Son of God and Son of David, I could see the argument being this, that Peter is the steward of God the Son. So notice that that's a way that you can say, oh yeah, so yeah, Jesus Eliakim might limit Peter Eliakim, and here's how it happens. And to me, that seems totally plausible, right? Especially like, I like to quote D.A. Carson on this point, because Carson mentions how similar images and similar metaphors are used between like the apostles and Jesus. So Jesus is the light of the world. Elsewhere, the apostles are described as the light of the world. Jesus is the foundation of the church. The apostles elsewhere are called the foundations of the church, right? And what Carson is saying is like the reason why these don't threaten the uniqueness of Jesus, why they don't pose a problem, is because you have to look at the immediate context. In what way are the disciples the light of the world, right? Okay, through their preaching and their ministry, right? In what way is Jesus the light of the world? Primarily through his salvific work, right? So he's the firstborn of all creation. He's the high point of anything that any human that has ever lived, right? So keeping all this in mind, then, some people say, well, Carson's talking about a metaphor there. He's not talking about typology. But I think the basic point still applies on an exegetical level, right? Exegetically speaking, what is John doing and what is Matthew doing? And are they competing or are they compatible? And I think when you look in context, you see, okay, Peter is the chief steward of God the Son of David, and Jesus is the chief steward, if you will, of God the Father, right? Especially in Revelation 3:7, in the previous passage, it talks about the Father as well. And I think Jesus interceding on our behalf to the Father, if I'm not mistaken. So already then I think we have vindication for the kind of solution that I'm offering.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good and strong point, Swan. So we just have just a few minutes left. Again, I would go much longer if I didn't schedule a doubleheader podcast this Monday morning. So anything else you want to get on the table quickly, Swan? And then, of course, I want you to mention where people can go if they want to go further in this. And again, I will reiterate that I want to have you and Daniel Vecchio back on here to do something, a lot more in the weeds and more in depth later on as well. So obviously we have not come close to covering everything, but we are planning on something much more meaty in the future. So yeah.
Yeah. As I said before, this argument is still developing in certain areas, and there's still a lot of research to be done. And I mean, I think this is probably going to be something like my master's thesis. So I'm applying to grad schools right now. So keep me in your prayers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful, Swan.
And, like sometimes, when you're producing content, you feel kind of bad because you're like, I just want to get the material out and I want to satisfy the people and their desire to have this complete argument. And I have to kind of exercise self-restraint, right? Yes. And say like,
to be responsible, right?
Right.
Yeah,
to be responsible with the research, right? And not give, I'm talking about myself here, not to give a half-baked product. Right?
Yeah, no, God bless you, Swan. Let me say something about that. There's a reason I don't really do response videos on here, and this isn't really we're not targeting any. I think there's use to that sometimes, but the problem is, at least for me, and I know for you, Swan, like my philosophy for the People channel, like this isn't what pays Pat Flynn's bills, right? And for people who are, I'm not accusing anyone in particular of this, but there are people whose YouTube views. That is their thing.
Yeah.
So there's an incentive to just get as many response videos out because they generate a lot of views, but then it tends to, be kind of crappy in quality a lot of times.
Yeah.
And the truth is, I can't even afford to get mixed up in that because I wouldn't have the time or resources to keep up with the back and forth response stuff. So for me, it's like, what's going on in the literature? And that's where I really want to ultimately, because then you have to really sit down and think and develop. So all of this is to say, I appreciate that restraint that you're showing, Suan, and I hope other people do that. It may take more time to get to the fully baked answer out there. But I think that's the best and the most responsible way to do it. And at the end of the day, that's going to be a more satisfying, project as well. So yeah, I go back and forth on the nature of like YouTube responses. They're helpful to a certain extent, but after a number of exchanges, like it's just got to go to the literature or some other, you know what I mean?
And I'll say too, I mean, that's why like my response videos tend to be so long. Yes. Because I am very careful and I try my best to bring 100 every time that I'm on the camera or doing something, so it's just a matter of respect, even for my interlocutor, that I'm, doing everything that I can.
Yeah. And even if you're not able to do that, like here again, we've been clear. This is just this is a summary statement, right? We're not covering everything. There's a lot more that needs to be said.
And all the nuances that can be given for an objection. Yeah.
Yeah, so let that be known. So Suan, let's finish with this. Your channel has been rebranded, so please give a plug for that and let us know what you've got cooking over there so people can get subscribed and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so my YouTube channel and podcast is called Intellectual Catholicism now. I got the approval of my bishop to call it that. So I'm really excited. Under Canon 216 of canon law, if you're going to call something Catholic, you need the approval of the church. So Beautiful. Just a header for other YouTubers out there. And also, if you could support me on Patreon, that would be greatly appreciated. So obviously, like, you don't have to. What we do with that money is I'm using it to pay my assistants to help manage like the channel as it grows. Also to preserve my mental and spiritual health so that I'm not constantly having to filter the comments myself, because that did take a toll on me when I did this the first time around. And then also, as our money grows, we're giving more and more of a percentage of the cut of the funds, to a pro-life charity. So, I've been donating with the money 12% right now to pro-life charities.
Yeah, God bless you.
So it goes to a good cause as well.
Yeah, well, I'm a supporter. I'm a happy supporter, and I will encourage other people to be as well. It's important that we keep projects like yours strong, Suan. So thank you so much, everybody. Again, stay tuned. I'm planning something, again, more significant with Suan and Daniel once they're once they move a little bit further along with that. In the meantime, stay tuned. I'll be back in just a couple minutes with Dr. Brian Kempel. We're gonna take a hard, gear shift and talk semiotics. So I gotta make that mental shift here on the fly. Suan, thank you so much, brother. God bless you.
Hey, God bless you.